When you think of an aircraft carrier, it is usually all about the aircraft and the firepower. What is usually omitted is the fact that more than 6,000 passengers occupy these vessels, and each person generates waste. The big question is what exactly happens with this waste? Where is it stored? And which regulations does the U.S. Navy need to follow to comply with international regulations? This is the genius technique used by the United States Navy to dispose of waste inside a $13 billion aircraft carrier. While commercial and cargo vessels rarely spend months sailing the vast ocean, a waste collection method is added to the vessel. This means that whenever a trash can is filled, it is merely taken to a waste storage facility or larger trash can, where it can be stored until the vessel reaches shore. Removing and disposing of this waste is one of the essential parts of maintaining the vessel before the next group of passengers arrives at a facility that is so clean you could lick the floors. But an aircraft carrier is a completely different beast. This $13 billion warship can stay at sea for close to 9 months on a single deployment. Each of the 6,000 sailors needs to be fed, use the restroom, and dispose of whatever waste is generated from living a decent life aboard a vessel. This can lead to complications, which cannot be mitigated by simply just using a waste storage facility. In fact, this could lead to disease. And what happens when one of these storage facilities eventually fills up? A new approach is needed, something that can dispose of the waste, while simultaneously complying with the MARPOL Annex 5 International Agreement established by the Committee on Shipboard Pollution Control, agreed to by the Navy and the National Research Council back in 2000. This regulation prevents any disposal of things like plastics in the ocean, or metals, glass, and paper in certain protected areas of the ocean. Under this agreement, the United States Navy had to come up with a brand new solution to this problem, ensuring not only protection for the United States, but also the environment in which these vessels operate. Adding to these woes is the fact that every couple of days or weeks, an aircraft carrier is resupplied, meaning that all this waste starts all over again. And the Navy needs to make enough space, or eventually, every compartment will be mainly designed for holding waste. So, what solution has the Navy found? Since the first few vessels were deployed to the world's oceans, disposal of waste was never truly a problem. Biodegradable materials such as wood were used to store fluids and drinks, while food was generally stored either in paper bags or in wooden compartments. Once a product is used and the wooden container cannot be reused, it is simply thrown overboard, allowing the ocean to do its job by slowly disintegrating the product before it merely vanishes. As for human waste, it would also be dumped back into the ocean, where the wastage would once again just disintegrate and form part of the natural environment. But as technology improved, the introduction of plastics turned into a big problem for the Navy. At first, disposing of these plastics in the ocean might have worked, but looking at the current state of global pollution, it is no longer a viable way of doing this. In fact, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration estimated that close to 100 metric tons of plastics are currently floating around the world's oceans, and the effects are profound. Not only are sea animals at risk of extinction, but it is severely impacting how the ocean works, even contributing to the problem of global warming. Moreover, the average aircraft carrier can generate up to 9 tons of waste each day, which includes plastic, metals, and other organic products. Should all this be dumped into the ocean, it can significantly increase the current problem the world is facing, which is why the Committee on Shipboard Pollution Control was first established and forced the Navy to come up with an alternative solution. Under these new guidelines, the Navy came up with an ingenious solution to ensure that waste products are simply destroyed instead of being dumped back into the ocean. But how does it work? In the original plan, known as the U.S. Navy 1993 plan, a new system was developed for how waste should be disposed of. The plan, which is modified today, was once one of the best methods of keeping the environment safe while disposing of waste. First of all, there is the problem of metals and glass. For example, canned foods are usually delivered in a tin can, which needs to be disposed of once the product has been finished. Glass, on the other hand, is used for storage containers, and food items or drinks can be delivered to the ship in these glass containers. But the Navy cannot simply just throw these waste products overboard and hope for the best. In fact, metals and glass products need to be completely crushed. Once they are in smaller pieces, the waste is put in cloth bags, where they are shot out into the ocean. But this needs to be done in international water and cannot be within 3 nautical miles of any sovereign country. The idea was that these products would sink to the bottom of the ocean, before eventually becoming part of the ocean floor, like what happens to a shipwreck when it goes down. As for paper and wood, the same process was suggested, and these paper products would be converted into a pulp before it gets shot into the ocean. It is a very effective method, as paper does tend to disintegrate over time. But when it came to plastic, the Navy had to scratch their heads. Since plastic takes hundreds of years to disintegrate, simply chucking it into the ocean is not viable, and it will undoubtedly lead to a lot of issues down the line. What the Navy planned to do was to melt down these plastics and create large discs. These discs would be moved to a different vessel as the carrier is being resupplied. It would then be up to the UNREP, Underway Replenishment Vessel, to dispose of the plastics once they reach shore. On paper, this method seems very effective, and the Navy could potentially use it as a way of getting rid of waste. Unfortunately, the disposal of metals, glass, and paper products violated Annex 5, which did not permit the U.S. Navy to shoot any waste materials into the ocean. For the Navy, this meant back to the drawing board, and a brand new system was needed. The first thing to understand is that aircraft carriers generate about 400 pounds of waste each hour. This forced the Navy to add a dedicated waste disposal compartment inside the vessel. About 16 sailors man this room as part of their rotational jobs and are continually focused on getting rid of the waste. This room is not like your typical mess hall. It is small, damp with moisture, and you can probably imagine the smell. But it is essential to ensure an aircraft carrier can spend a few months in the ocean. First, sailors will need to separate waste into a few distinct bins. These are glass, plastics, paper, organic waste, stainless steel, and aluminum. The easiest to dispose of are paper and food waste, which is usually passed through a shredder that cuts each item into 12mm pieces. All of this can only happen at least 3 nautical miles into the ocean. Once it is small enough, the waste is generally shot out into the ocean, but is small enough not to affect the ecosystem. At about 12 nautical miles, the Navy starts burning things. Combustible items such as wood, textiles, and fabrics are burned so as to not affect the atmospheric conditions of any nearby country. These items are usually charred and burned until nothing is left before the remains will find their way into the ocean, but small enough not to hamper the ecosystem. Once the vessel reaches 25 nautical miles from the coast, glass and metal objects are finally crushed before being put into biodegradable bags and dumped overboard. This sounds pretty similar to the initial solutions proposed in 1993, but with modern technology, these metal and glass objects are extremely fine, and by the time they reach the bottom of the ocean, they cannot cause any further harm to the ocean. As for plastic, the system is still very similar, and using a strong compression machine, plastics are all put together before being compressed into discs and then transferred over to another vessel. The process doesn't cause any damage to the environment, but it is one of the most tedious processes, and for the sailors working these stations, it can be quite a demanding job. So, the United States decided to work with a company named Pyrogenesis, and within a few years, the Plasma Arc Waste Disposal System became a reality. The Plasma Arc Waste Destruction System, PAWDS, was first deployed on the brand new USS Gerald R. Ford aircraft carrier in 2022. It is so far the only vessel in the U.S. Navy that uses this Dispose system, but the system will also be added to the brand new aircraft carrier, the USS John F. Kennedy, that should be available for use soon by the Navy. So, exactly how does the system work? Well, first of all, a study by Harvard revealed that this system operates at a temperature of about 5,000 degrees Celsius. Once the waste items have been added, the PAWDS system uses what is known as plasma arc gasification, which essentially transforms the waste into vapor. This means that once all the waste has been destroyed, a little bit of dust is the only thing remaining. Moreover, the PAWDS system doesn't generate any smoke, despite its high temperatures, which means that it can work for an entire day, despite flight operations taking place on the flight deck. The USS Gerald R. Ford no longer needs to dispose of large cloth bags of waste in the oceans, nor do they need to ensure optimal storage is available for plastic pucks that need to be unloaded, either to another vessel or at the port. It significantly reduces the time it takes to dispose of waste, while also ensuring that no space is wasted aboard the vessel. Today, this is one of the main differences between the USS Gerald R. Ford and other Nimitz-class carriers, which still heavily rely on the older methods. But what about the future? As early as 2019, the Royal Navy introduced two unique pyrolysis plants to the HMS Prince of Wales aircraft carrier. Despite only having a crew of about 1,000 sailors, it still needs to deal with tons of trash and waste that is generated each day. However, the way in which this system works gives us insight into the PAWDS system and how it might be functioning. Much like PAWDS, this plant operates at a temperature of 1,000 degrees Celsius. But instead of using fuel to keep stoking the fire, this new system only generates enough heat to get the system going. Once enough heat has been generated, the system shuts off, using the waste added to continue vaporizing everything. Similar to the US system, it will then transform this wastage into vapor, with just a few bags of dust being left behind once the system has completed its job. But these systems are not fail-proof, and occasionally, the Navy might run into a problem, especially when one of the systems stops working. Despite Nimitz-class carriers having up to 12 waste management systems spread throughout the vessel, one of them failing could send the whole vessel into a panic. As mentioned, these vessels generate tons of trash each day, and if it cannot be managed, it needs to be stored. Word quickly makes its way up the chain of command, where the captain will immediately order that the system be fixed. Replacement components are usually stored on board, but this can be supplied to the vessel almost immediately. In fact, the captain will want to make sure that the carrier itself is always in the best condition, and no one wants to be forced to cut down on wastage, which can severely impact the quality of life of these sailors. That leaves us with only one more problem. What happens to radioactive and hazardous materials? The answer to this question is actually rather simple. Radioactive and hazardous materials cannot be disposed of in the ocean. In fact, it can lead to severe problems such as mutations in the oceans and affect all marine life. The Navy is forced to store these items in safe areas, where they are then transferred to other vessels or the port. The materials then follow the standard procedure of disposal that is usually used to dispose of them on land. But life aboard an aircraft carrier can be tough when things don't go right. And for those working in the waste management section, it can be a tedious and tough job. But do you think you can overcome a day living aboard an aircraft carrier? Let us know in the comments below, and please make sure you are subscribed to our channel.